My name is Owu, and I am 22 years old this year. This year, I was admitted to my ideal university. The freshmen at university are like wild geese spreading their wings and leaving home, finally gaining the opportunity for freedom and independence. My mom said that once you go to university, you're an adult and you have to handle your own affairs. So I declined the kindness of my older brother and mom, insisting on finding a place by myself, believing that I could handle it well. There were many rental notices on the school bulletin board, and I didn't know how to distinguish between good and bad ones. I randomly picked up a phone number and contacted the landlord. The person on the other end was surnamed Zhao, a local. We chatted on the phone, and I felt that his place was not bad, so we agreed on a time to view the property. On Sunday, I met the landlord, Mr. Zhao, who had a big belly and was chewing gum, speaking in a loud voice. On the way to the rental place, he chatted and joked with me, saying that the area was blessed with talented people and beautiful scenery, and that renting his place would guarantee top scores in exams. Our car drove deeper and deeper into the mountains, and I thought to myself, this is completely in the wilderness. After turning around a winding mountain road about 2 kilometers long, a sizable residential area appeared before us. Just by looking at the exterior, the houses seemed clean. The environment here was indeed good. Mr. Zhao took me upstairs while explaining the history of the residential area. He owned the property rights to a 4-story building here, and since the occupancy rate was not as expected, he decided to renovate it into apartments specifically for rent to students and working people nearby. Mr. Zhao took out his keys and opened the iron door on the 4th floor, leading me in. The room was a large house with 3 bedrooms and 2 living rooms. As a poor student just starting university, the rent was already beyond my expectations. Mr. Zhao smiled and said, "You can find classmates to live together and share the rent. I can also give you some discounted prices." I was persuaded. And besides, sharing the rent with classmates would be more cost-effective. Although I was still a bit hesitant, I signed the contract with the landlord. Looking at the house I was about to move into, I was extremely delighted, finally able to start my own life. But I forgot that when I viewed the house, I was too elated and didn't notice that the bathroom didn't have a mirror. It was only after I had moved all my things in and settled that I discovered this. I was suspicious and called the landlord, who said that the previous tenant had broken it and hadn't had the time to install a new one. I couldn't figure out what the previous tenant could have done in the bathroom to break the mirror. Could they have been practicing a roundhouse kick? Fortunately, the lack of a mirror didn't have too much impact on me. Soon it was the start of the school year, and I had found 2 other roommates as planned. Everything seemed to be going exceptionally smoothly. By the time the 2 guys had settled their luggage, it was already 2 weeks later. During this period, the house was bustling with noise until late at night. One weekend, both roommates coincidentally said they were going home, leaving me alone in the rental house. This was the first time since moving in that I was alone here over the weekend. On Friday evening, Mr. Zhao, the landlord, contacted me, saying he had found a craftsman to install a mirror for us. I was overjoyed to hear this, as not having a mirror in the bathroom was indeed very inconvenient, especially when shaving and not knowing if I had shaved clean. The glassworker rang the doorbell at around 7 o'clock. As soon as he entered, he asked me if my home was preparing to install a mirror. He looked puzzled, not knowing the reason. Before I could understand his meaning, he had already walked into the bathroom and started working. The old master's skills were proficient, and in just a few moves, he had installed a new mirror, restoring the bathroom's original sense of unity. It turned out that the absence of a mirror was so conspicuous. After the new mirror was installed, I looked at myself in the mirror and felt a bit strange. Perhaps it was because I had never seen my reflection in this bathroom like this before. I tried to convince myself. The next night, after arranging dinner at the market near the school and riding home, I returned to the apartment building in 5 minutes. As I took out the key from my pocket to open the door, I noticed my right hand was shaking uncontrollably. The boundless darkness behind me pressed down on me, and I hurriedly opened the door and ran up to the 4th floor at the fastest speed. Suddenly, I heard a clear and pleasant female voice humming a song. Perhaps it was a resident of this building singing. As I turned the key, the sound came out again, and this time I heard it clearly. The hairs on my body stood up, because the melodious and mournful singing was coming from my room. My heart was filled with terror, not knowing what to do. Cold sweat dripped from my forehead, and I kept taking deep breaths to try to calm the growing fear, as if it was an auditory hallucination. After 2 deep breaths, the sound was gone. I stood at the door for about 5 minutes, before I hesitantly entered the house. In the pitch darkness, I reached out and found the light switch on the wall. With a click, the room was bathed in light. There was nothing unusual. Everything was just as it had been when I left. I thought I was hallucinating, so I turned on the TV and ate dinner, deliberately turning the volume up to the maximum to cover up my inner unease. I was a bit mesmerized by the variety show, when suddenly I heard a sound. I looked around, making sure there was no one else in the house besides me. At that moment, the sound came again, still just a... My hair stood on end. This was not an illusion. I had indeed heard a girl's, and it reminded me of the singing woman's voice I heard 2 hours ago. An indescribable sense of fear crept up my scalp. In a panic, I fled the apartment, jumped on my motorcycle, and sped to a nearby internet cafe near the school, staying there for the night at 100 kilometers per hour. Because there was a woman hiding in my house, I only hoped that it was all auditory hallucinations and illusions. The terrifying experience from that Saturday night still keeps me awake to this day. I vividly remember. It was a rainy evening with dark clouds covering the sky, and fierce winds howling against the window frames. Alone in my rented room, I was painstakingly reading the last chapter of my thesis, racing against the clock to finish my work. The fully lit desk lamp was glaring in the twilight, forcing me to rub my sore eyes from time to time. The lonely night seemed especially long, with only the sound of the keyboard and the rustling of pages breaking the silence of the rental house. Occasionally, strange noises would come from outside, like someone dragging their feet in the hallway. I unconsciously looked up to see the dim hallway light casting a shadow. It must be another tenant coming back, I reassured myself, and continued to focus on revising my thesis, between carefully chosen words. The footsteps did not cease, but became clearer and heavier, like a beast stalking its prey. A sense of unease welled up in my heart. Suddenly, a loud noise came through, as if someone was forcefully hitting the door, followed by more impacts, dull yet powerful, making the door vibrate. My heart rate soared, and it felt like my blood had solidified. Who would knock on the door so brutally in the middle of the night? Countless terrible guesses flashed through my mind. Could the instigator be a local thug or a thief? If they broke in, I, a single girl, would be in danger. I quickly grabbed my phone, my fingers trembling as I dialed the emergency number. At the same time, I quietly approached the door and peeked through the peephole. Outside was pitch black, with no sign of anyone. The knocking continued, echoing and deafening, making me shudder. I huddled in a corner, waiting for the police to arrive. The wait was long and painful, with my heart desperately longing for the sound of sirens. Suddenly, the hallway lights flickered, and all the knocking stopped, everything returning to silence as if nothing had happened. I held my breath and listened quietly. There was no movement in the hallway or the stairwell. Not even the occasional footsteps that I usually heard had vanished without a trace. About 10 minutes later, the sirens finally sounded in the night. I felt a huge relief and rushed to the door, flinging it open. 3 police officers with sturdy beards, holding shields and stun guns, stood in front of me, nodding cautiously. "Is the caller inside? How is the situation?" one of them demanded loudly. My gaze scanned the hallway, empty except for the silent darkness. "There doesn't seem to be anyone," I stammered nervously. The abnormality of the situation truly sent shivers down my spine. The 3 officers exchanged glances, and one of them stepped forward and kicked my door hard. The door didn't budge, as solid as if it were made of steel. The officer turned back to me, his face full of suspicion. "Are you sure someone was knocking on your door?" "There's no damage to the door," I nodded, wiping the cold sweat from my forehead. How could such a violent impact leave no trace? Where did the sound come from? Someone must have been playing a prank on me in the middle of the night. However, with the police interruption, the prankster probably fled. Regardless, seeing the 3 police officers in front of me, I finally felt a weight lifted from my heart. They inspected my room at my request and found no suspicious signs. As they left, one of the officers patted my shoulder seriously and said, "You must be more careful. Living alone is too dangerous. If you encounter a similar situation again, call the police immediately. We will come at any time." Since then, my nights have been anything but peaceful. Even the slightest sound makes my hair stand on end. Gradually, I became neurotic, vigilant against every subtle change in my environment, and that deafening knocking sound became an inescapable nightmare, visiting me punctually every night. Eventually, I could no longer bear the constant fear, and decided to move out of that dreadful rental house. When I first started working, due to financial constraints, I rented a single room next to my workplace. However, ever since I moved into this house, paranormal events have never ceased. According to my friend, it's like I could make a horror film. My friend recalls that on the day he moved in, he was awakened in the middle of the night by a cold breeze. With his eyes slightly open, he suddenly felt an unusual chill around him. It was the height of summer, yet the room felt colder than with air conditioning on. It was a damp, eerie coldness. He pulled the quilt tighter around himself, preparing to continue sleeping. But then he distinctly felt gusts of cold air blowing on the back of his neck, as if someone was deliberately blowing on it from behind. He suddenly turned his head and saw a figure standing by the door, looking at him silently in the moonlight. My friend said that any trace of sleepiness he had was gone in an instant. My friend immediately got up from the bed, turned on the light in the room, and the shadow disappeared. Thinking he was just scaring himself, he turned off the light to continue sleeping. As soon as he turned off the light, the shadow reappeared by the door, fluttering vaguely. He quickly turned the light back on, and the shadow disappeared once more. Unable to lie still any longer, my friend got up and slowly walked step by step to where the shadow had been by the door. Upon closer inspection, he found nothing, but then he felt the cold air on the back of his neck again. He turned his head sharply, and at that moment, the lights in the room went out instantly. Next to the bed, by the curtains, he spotted the shadow. Filled with terror, he wanted to open the door and go out immediately. But for some reason, whether it was due to unfamiliarity with the lock on his first day or something else, the door lock simply wouldn't open no matter how he tried. Then, as my friend looked back, the shadow by the curtains had slowly moved to the side of his bed. At this point, the room's light came on and the shadow vanished. Using the light, my friend looked around the room and then easily opened the main door. He found the air coming in through the door to be so warm. But why was the room so cold? He stood at the door for a while, pondering what had just happened, feeling it was incredible and even doubting whether his mind had just short-circuited. He then closed the door and returned to the room. At this point, there was no sleep to be had, so he turned on the computer and worked on some documents for a while. The next night, my friend was awakened again by the cold air. This time, he clearly saw a dark figure standing behind the slightly swaying curtains next to him. Staring at him, with a shout of fear, he called out, "Who's there?" and turned on the bedside lamp. Just like the night before, the light went out within 2 seconds of turning on, plunging the room back into darkness, and the shadow was now right by the bed. According to my friend, the shadow was very close to him. The only thing he could do at that moment was to cover himself completely with the quilt, not letting any part of his body show, and at that time he felt a cold air slowly blowing towards his back. Terrified, my friend covered his head with the quilt, got out of bed, and ran to the front door, preparing to open it, but the door still wouldn't budge. After about 10 seconds, the bedside lamp lit up, and everything returned to calm. For several consecutive days, it was the same. Whenever he slept until the middle of the night, he would be awakened by the cold, eerie wind, and then the shadow would appear as if on cue. My friend said those days were exhausting, as if everything around him was a potential threat. Eventually, with no other choice, he stayed up all night playing games on his computer with the lights on. And during the day at work, he would take naps on his office desk whenever he could. When his supervisor noticed him sleeping at work and criticized him, my friend explained what he had been experiencing. However, his supervisor dismissed his story as mere excuses. My friend said he tried every possible solution, such as placing scissors under the pillow, silently reciting Buddhist chants, buying a peach wood sword, and so on. But none of it worked. The expected event still arrived on time as if nothing could. He could no longer bear living in that house. So after a few days, he rented a cheaper place. And only then did he start to live a more peaceful life.